Somebody mapped it. That is the part they don't talk about. In the 1880s and 1890s, government surveyors, archaeologists from the newly formed Bureau of American Ethnology, and early cartographers fanned out across the American interior and began documenting something extraordinary. The ruins and earthwork profiles of cities so large, so precisely planned, and so sophisticated that the reports they filed read like dispatches from a foreign country, not a foreign country across the ocean. One that had existed right here, under American soil, for centuries, before anyone thought to look, and then, almost as quietly as the surveys were completed, the cities themselves began to disappear. Not because time erased them. Because we did. That is the story the official version glosses over in a paragraph, or skips entirely. Cities the size of medieval London, road networks that stretched hundreds of miles across desert that had no wheeled vehicles and no horses to use them, a pyramid larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza, and the mainstream textbook treatment amounts to a handful of sentences about Native Americans living in small agrarian communities before European contact. The data says something else entirely. The data says something that should have rewritten every American history curriculum ever printed. Let's lay it out from the beginning. Start with a city called Cahokia. If you grew up in the United States, you may have seen the name on a highway sign driving through southern Illinois, just east of St. Louis. You probably didn't stop. Almost no one does. That is precisely the problem. Cahokia was not a village. Cahokia was not a settlement. At its peak, around 1100 CE, Cahokia was the largest city north of Mexico. Archaeologists estimate its population ranged somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people within the urban core, with the higher end of estimates incorporating outlying communities and agricultural villages that fed the center, reaching figures that some researchers put as high as 40,000. To put that in context, in the year 1100, the City of London held roughly the same number of people. Paris was comparable. Cahokia, sitting in the floodplain of the Mississippi River in what is now the American Midwest, was operating at the same scale as the great cities of medieval Europe. At the same moment in history, the official version of American prehistory rarely pauses on that sentence long enough to let it land. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. The size of the population isn't even the most striking thing about Cahokia. The most striking thing is what they built. Archaeologists have calculated that across the entire Cahokia complex, the builders moved more than 55 million cubic feet of earth, basket by basket, on human backs, without draft animals, without the wheel to construct a network of more than 120 earthen mounds spread across 6 square miles of landscape. The city was not random. It was planned. It was divided into residential, public, and specialized zones. There were plazas, a wooden stockade wall over 2 miles long with guard towers every 70 feet, a copper workshop, thousands of houses arranged in rows, and at the center of it all, one structure that stops engineers cold when they actually do the arithmetic on it. Monks Mound, the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in the entire Western Hemisphere. The numbers here need a moment. Monks Mound rises 100 feet into the air. It is approximately 955 feet long and 775 feet wide, featuring 4 stepped terraces rising one above the other. Its base footprint is roughly the same size as the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is, depending on the measure used, the 3rd largest pyramid in the Western Hemisphere, after only Cholula and Teotihuacan in Mexico, and it was built entirely of earth, tens of millions of cubic feet of carefully selected and layered soil and clay, carried in woven baskets by human hands, engineered with enough understanding of soil mechanics that the structure is still standing more than 1,000 years later. Recent Bayesian analysis of radiocarbon dates suggests the primary structure of Monks Mound may have been completed in as few as 20 years. 20 years to move that volume of earth, in precise layers, on 4 deliberate terraces, without a single metal tool or wheeled cart. Engineers who study the construction today Note that the builders incorporated different soil types and clay layers to manage drainage and stability, a technique that reflects a working knowledge of geotechnical principles that most people assume only emerged in modern construction. And the Grand Plaza, to its south 50 acres, over 1,600 feet long, was not built on flat ground. Soil studies have shown that the original terrain there was rolling and uneven. The Cahokians leveled it deliberately. 50 acres of undulating ground, manually graded to a precise flat plane, serving as a ceremonial and civic center. Researchers describe it as one of the earliest large-scale construction projects in North American history. Now, hold all of that in your mind for a moment, and then ask yourself, when did you first learn about it? If you're like most people, the honest answer is recently, or never, until something like this. And the reason for that is not a mystery. It is, in a way, a documented historical process. Here is what happened to Cahokia after it was abandoned, and it was abandoned completely by around 1400 CE, for reasons archaeologists still debate. Environmental stress, political fragmentation, the beginning of what climatologists call the Little Ice Age. Possibly all three. Whatever the cause, by the time European settlers arrived in the region, the city was gone. The mounds were still there, enormous, unmistakable, rising from the Mississippi floodplain, but no one was living in them, and so began what can only be described as one of the most consequential acts of erasure in American history, carried out not in secret, but in broad daylight, in the growing cities of the 19th century. St. Louis, Missouri, directly across the river from the Cahokia site, was platted and settled in the early 1800s. Historical records show that the city was literally defined, in its early years, by the dozens of Cahokian mounds that rose from the ground across the river and on the St. Louis side itself. The area was known at one point as Mound City, and then, as the city grew and needed fill material for construction and leveling, the mounds were systematically demolished. Nearly all the mounds that had once stood in what is now downtown St. Louis were destroyed in the mid-19th century. Basket by basket, in reverse, the earth that 10,000 people had carried to build a civilization was loaded into carts and spread under the foundations of a new one. A highway runs through the heart of the Cahokia site today, separating Monks Mound from the interpretive center. The site was only designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982, the same year it joined the Pyramids of Egypt, Machu Picchu, and the Great Wall of China on the global list of irreplaceable human heritage. Before that, it had been a state park. Before that, it had been farmland, plowed for decades, its mounds eroding under the plow, its archaeology scattered across the topsoil. And that's only one city. If that alone is hard to explain, now it gets really interesting. Cahokia was not an isolated anomaly. It was the largest and most visible node of a culture that covered most of the eastern half of North America, what archaeologists call the Mississippian culture, a network of indigenous peoples that thrived from roughly 800 CE to 1,600 CE across the Midwestern, Eastern, and Southeastern United States. Mississippian settlements built earthen mounds, maintained long-distance trade routes, and organized hierarchical societies with specialized labor classes. Their trade goods, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, stone tools from the Mill Creek quarries in southern Illinois, show up at sites hundreds of miles from where they were made. This was not a collection of isolated villages. This was a connected, functioning civilization operating at a continental scale. One of its lesser-known centers is a place called Etzanoa in what is now south-central Kansas. The Wichita people built a city there that historical accounts suggest held a population of around 20,000 people, a figure that would have made it, at its time, one of the largest cities in North America. Spanish explorer Juan de Oñate encountered it in 1601 and described an enormous settlement stretching for miles along a river. Archaeologists working at the site in the early 21st century confirmed the density of the occupation, thousands of houses, an enormous quantity of archaeological material, Etzanoa was eventually abandoned after Spanish contact, devastated by the same wave of European disease that swept through indigenous populations across the continent. The city is barely mentioned in any standard American history course, but we're not at the core yet, because while Cahokia and Etzanoa represent the scale of what was lost, neither of them presents the engineering anomaly that truly bends the mind of modern analysts. For that, you have to go to the desert. Chaco Canyon, in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, was the center of the ancestral Puebloan world between roughly 850 and 1150 CE. The buildings at Chaco, massive stone complexes called great houses, some rising 5 stories high, built from millions of carefully shaped sandstone blocks, have been studied intensively for over a century. The engineering is extraordinary. Multi-story architecture, precisely oriented to cardinal directions and solar events, constructed with stone tools and without metal, in one of the most arid and resource-poor environments in North America. But the feature of Chaco that truly defies simple explanation is not the buildings, it is the roads. Archaeologists have documented more than 400 miles of prehistoric roadway radiating out from Chaco Canyon across the San Juan Basin. These were not casual footpaths. They were engineered routes, typically around 30 feet wide, cut into the desert surface, cleared of rock, with formal edges and, in some places, constructed roadbeds. They ran with an almost obsessive straightness, not following terrain, not winding around hills, but proceeding in near-perfect straight lines across the landscape, cutting through obstacles rather than around them. The Great North Road runs approximately 35 miles due north from Pueblo Alto in Chaco Canyon, following a precise cardinal orientation. Some of the roads show evidence of alignment with celestial events, solstice sunrises, prominent topographic sighting lines. The road building reached its peak between 1050 and 1100 CE, the same period during which Cahokia, on the other side of the continent, was experiencing its own explosion of monumental construction. And here is the detail that engineers and archaeologists have been quietly arguing about for decades. The Chacoan people had no wheeled vehicles. They had no horses or pack animals. In a society without carts and without draft animals, what was the practical function of 30-foot wide, perfectly straight, engineered roads that run for dozens of miles across empty desert? The official answer is that the roads served ceremonial, ritual, and social functions, that they were expressions of cosmological thinking rather than purely utilitarian infrastructure. That is likely part of the truth, but the engineering investment required to build 400 miles of precisely constructed roadway in that terrain, with only human labor and stone tools, is not an accident. It is a deliberate, massive, coordinated expenditure of resources that implies a level of social organization and centralized planning that the textbook model of pre-Columbian North America simply does not account for. Some researchers argue that what the Chaco Road network reveals is a regional, political, and economic integration, a proto-state, or something functionally close to it, connecting outlier communities to the canyon through infrastructure as much as through ideology. The roads become evidence not just of ritual sophistication, but of administrative reach. The question the data keeps raising is the one the official version keeps deferring. What exactly were these people doing? And why does the scale of what they built keep exceeding what we assumed they were capable of? Coincidence? Possibly, but a coincidence that sits suspiciously close to a pattern. And here's where it gets uncomfortable in a different way. The erasure of these cities from American public consciousness is not simply a matter of academic oversight. There is a documented history of how the mound builder question was handled by American institutions in the 19th century. When the mounds of the Mississippi and Ohio valleys were first being systematically documented in the early 1800s, there was a widespread reluctance among commentators to attribute them to the ancestors of the people who were still living on the land. The idea that the ancestors of Native Americans had built cities comparable in scale to those of Europe was, for many 19th century Americans, literally inconceivable. Various alternative theories circulated that a lost race had built the mounds, that they were the work of some vanished civilization unconnected to existing indigenous peoples. The Bureau of American Ethnology, under the direction of Cyrus Thomas, published a landmark report in 1894 that definitively attributed the mounds to the ancestors of contemporary Native American peoples, a conclusion that has been consistently confirmed by every serious archaeological investigation since. But the popular mythology of a lost race of mound builders had already done its damage, muddying the waters and making it easier for the actual history to be set aside. By the time the science caught up with what the mounds actually were, the cultural and educational infrastructure had already decided that pre-Columbian North America was a sparsely populated wilderness of small bands and villages. That story was easier, it fit the narrative, and it persisted, in textbooks, in curricula, in the popular imagination, long after the archaeological evidence had quietly made it obsolete. The Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site was not designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site until 1982. For reference, the same designation had been given to the Egyptian pyramids the year before, the same tier, the same global significance. Most Americans have never heard of it. Lay the data points side by side. 1. A city in southern Illinois at 1100 CE, as large as medieval London, built around a pyramid with the same footprint as the Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed entirely by human hands, moving tens of millions of cubic feet of earth in baskets, with a level of geotechnical engineering that left it standing for 1,000 years and then nearly destroyed in the 19th century, used as fill material for a growing American city. 2. A network of settlements across the eastern half of North America, connected by trade routes carrying copper, shells, and finished goods across 1,000 miles of territory, organized under hierarchical social structures with specialized labor, ceremonial centers, and urban planning, a civilization operating at a continental scale, reduced in the standard narrative to a footnote between the pilgrims and the frontier. 3. 400 miles of precisely engineered, 3.0 foot wide, laser-straight roads in the New Mexico desert, built by a society with no wheeled vehicles, aligning with cardinal directions and celestial events, connecting a network of great stone houses to a ceremonial center in one of the most inhospitable environments on the continent, a road system that has no practical analog anywhere else in pre-Columbian North America, and that engineers today still cannot fully explain in terms of function. 4. The documented process by which the people who built all of this were systematically stripped of their history, not through secret conspiracy, but through something more banal and more persistent, the assumption that what was here before Columbus could not have been significant enough to record, preserve, or teach. The giro of thesis is this: we have been asking the wrong question. The question has always been framed as, what happened to these civilizations? Why did they collapse? Why did they disappear? The data suggests a more precise question. The question is, who decided that their disappearance was the end of the story, rather than the beginning of an investigation? Because they did not disappear quietly into prehistory. They were mapped, they were documented, their earthworks were surveyed by government agencies, their trade goods were catalogued by museum expeditions, their cities sat above ground, massive and unmistakable, right up to the moment that other cities were built on top of them. The official version says that pre-Columbian North America was a land of scattered peoples living close to the land, waiting for civilization to arrive from across the ocean. The data says there were cities here larger than anything Columbus had ever seen. The data says there were road systems here that organized a desert region the size of a European country. The data says there was a metropolis in Illinois that, for a brief window around the year 1100, rivaled the largest cities on Earth. That is not a fringe interpretation. That is what the surveys found. That is what the archaeology confirms. That is what the UNESCO designation acknowledges, quietly, for anyone paying attention. The question that remains, and it is not a comfortable one, is not whether these civilizations existed. They did. The question is why knowing about them still feels, in 2025, like discovering something that was hidden. Why a city the size of London, sitting in the American Midwest, decorated with the third largest pyramid in the Western Hemisphere, is something most people learn about from a YouTube video rather than from the first chapter of every American history textbook ever printed. That isn't archaeology's failure. The archaeology has been there for 150 years. That is a story about what we chose to remember and what we chose to build on top of instead. The ground beneath American cities holds more than foundations. The next investigation goes further into what was deliberately removed and what the early government surveys recorded before anyone thought to stop them. If what stands above the surface is hard to explain, what they found underneath it is harder still.